What sort of role did drugs play in Meredith Kirch's murder? 17 years after the fact, can you remember the scale and scope of the drugs narrative in this particular case? Would you say drugs are irrelevant, a little relevant but mostly harmless, somewhat relevant, or absolutely key to the events that led to Meredith's savage murder on the night of November 1st? It's interesting that the 21-year-old woman who was murdered had only one concern when it came to Perugia: drugs. Was her concern overblown? If you could speak to Meredith directly, or if she could speak to you directly, do you think the conversation would be that drugs didn't matter, or that they did?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't breathe. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. I'm communicating with you in France, but I will be in Italy tomorrow around about this time. I can tell you, having traveled through Italy, about being approached by random strangers, for example, in Florence, where a big black dude tried to cozy up to me very shortly after I'd parked my car. In fact, he came up to me twice in less than half an hour. And then I watched as he tried to latch onto someone else a few feet away, trying to find out where that someone was from, just as he did with me, trying to get them to high-five him. What does Follane say about drugs? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, we'll be continuing coverage of the Amanda Knox case in Perugia on the 31st and the 1st, so look out for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So again, what does John Follane say about drugs? Well, let's have a look. Well, as early as page 2, which is to say from the very beginning, drugs are mentioned in John Follane's definitive narrative on the Knox case, A Death in Italy. I don't think drugs are mentioned on page 2, right over here, in Follane's book, because it's not important. And I have to say, my encounter in Florence definitely made me think of this reference in Follane's book, especially the idea of persistent pestering, or in Follane's words, forever trying to attract the attention of the students. It's also not as if Follane brings up drugs and then never to do so again, or without any additional reinforcement. Just 6 pages later, Follane provides some statistical support with this reference. He writes, "A city of its size, meaning Perugia, has a population of 160,000, but in recent years the city's growing prosperity and its student population have attracted drug dealers who skulk in its dark alleys as they wait for customers. In 2007, 25 people died of a drug overdose in the province of Perugia, the highest number of such deaths in any Italian province." Now, the most drug overdoses in Italy seem to be occurring in Perugia. So if you thought drugs were irrelevant to the story, or only somewhat relevant, it seems these statistics disagree with you. And you might say, well, I don't really believe the statistics. Well, let's see if the statistics agree with other aspects, whether there's congruency between the stats and other aspects in the narrative. So that is interesting to compare the level of drug attraction of some in the story, or drug attraction to some perhaps in the story, as well as to those of others. Did some like taking drugs and others didn't? What kind of situation do you think it creates if you are sharing space with someone who has a particular, let's say, an affinity with drugs versus someone else who perhaps feels differently about it? Do you think that might be a recipe for conflict, just that on its own? And I can tell you that alone is a recipe for high drama, if not nuclear conflict, when people are living together. So let's have a look at what was Amanda Knox's relationship with drugs. And Folane is now quoting someone very close to Knox who should know something about it, and that is her sister Deanna, who says Amanda didn't do violence and also she didn't do drugs. But then there's a qualification. Well, only a little. In the entire time that Amanda lived in Seattle, she had smoked a joint maybe twice. So in other words, there's kind of a sense of Amanda Knox did a little bit of drugs, but it was mostly harmless and nothing to really worry about. Deanna, I think, also said that Knox likes experimenting and wants to try everything. And I think that sort of insight into her psychology tells you kind of a lot about the potential situation one is dealing with here. Now, what about Rudy Gaday's appetite for drugs and Raffaele Solicito's? Well, from Folane's narrative, he says, he refers to Rudy saying, I'd like to screw her, meaning, I think, Amanda Knox. Then he says, moments later, Amanda herself knocked on the door. The men burst out laughing but couldn't tell her what the joke was. One of them rolled a joint and passed it around. So this is the sort of everyday scenario going on inside the villa. Rudy's there. The guys are there. Amanda Knox is there. They're rolling a joint, passing it around. Rudy is impressed by how deeply Amanda inhales when she smokes the joint and says, she's a great smoker. She often comes here and we smoke joints together, one of the boys told him. Now, technically what that means is one of the boys in the villa who lives there is saying Amanda Knox is a great smoker. She often comes here and we smoke joints together. Now, if we go back to Folane's reference, quoting Deanna, she says she had smoked a joint maybe twice. Now, does that concur, does that sort of slight experience concur with what is happening in the villa? That she maybe rolled a joint twice? Well, not according to this commentary. She's a great smoker. She often comes here and we smoke joints together. They were still smoking when Meredith joined them. And so this is really important. How does Meredith fit into this whole dynamic? And the answer is that she took just one pull on the joint. She was no habitual smoker. So here we have a clear distinction, certainly from Folane's narrative, not only of how Knox and Kircher differed when it came to drug use, but also Rudy Gaday's interest in it as well. Who would you say, in terms of the drug narrative, certainly just what we've looked at here, who were a more suitable match, Meredith and Rudy or Knox and Rudy? We also find that Patrick Lumumba has had to confront drug dealers in Perugia as well. The bottom of a page dealing with Knox working for Lumumba, he writes, he was always ready to help his friends, meaning Patrick Lumumba, and even strangers. He once ran after a drug addict who had stolen a woman's bag and recovered it for her. Now, interestingly, Solicito's first brush with the law, like Knox, also involved drugs. Shortly before leaving, he had his first brush with the law when police found him and two friends in possession of 2.6 grams of hashish. Now, you might say, well, that's really nothing. That's really nothing to worry about. But that's what we know about. Then, in terms of Amanda Knox, it says in early July, Amanda had her only brush with the law in Seattle. She and the 5 female students she shared a house with were throwing a leaving party. And people had too much to drink. They threw stones, empty beer bottles and cans, and, well, there you have it. Now, you might say, maybe Folane is a stick in the mud. Are there any references to drugs in the media besides his? Maybe we've got to look beyond what he talks about. Well, it turns out there are. Let's go to drug references in the media narrative. This is from the BBC. It emerged that she, meaning Amanda Knox, had written a short story on a social networking site about a man who drugs and does something to a young girl. Now, you've got to think about this as well. If you don't have a lot of experience with drugs or you're not interested in drugs, why would you write a story involving drugs? And Solicito apparently also wrote a letter to his father in prison and said, "The Amanda I know lives a carefree life. Her only thought is the pursuit of pleasure." What do you think that implies or suggests? Then there's another article from the Daily Mail. Could a drug dealer who had sex with Amanda Knox, think about that, a drug dealer had sex with Amanda Knox, could that be a vital clue in solving Meredith Kercher's murder? Now, I think you've also got to think about what kind of level of drug interest or drug involvement or drug use are we dealing with when someone has sex with a drug dealer? Does that mean you're not really interested in drugs? And I suppose it could mean that. Or does that mean that you likely are interested? And then we've also got these sources from The Week. Amanda Knox's links to drug dealer used in extradition bid. And this is quite interesting because it refers to the actual legal narrative, or certainly attempts to bring it into the legal narrative. Quote, Italian prosecutors claim they have evidence of extensive links between Amanda Knox and a cocaine dealer in Perugia. Prosecutors are currently pushing for Knox to be extradited from the US to face justice in Italy, and we know that that failed. They claim Knox had phone conversations with a drug dealer in the days before and after Kercher's murder on 1st of November 2007. Knox was also said to have had a relationship of a sexual nature with a supplier and spent cash at an alarming rate while in Italy. Now, that's something we can certainly confirm, that Knox was spending cash at an alarming rate. It really looked like she was drawing the maximum amount of cash every day. And so that's certainly something that seems to be, there seems to be evidence for that. And then one's got to say, well, what was that money being spent on? Then the article goes on to note, one man has already been convicted for dealing cocaine based on information from Knox's phone. A police report attached to Knox's file states, in the course of the investigation regarding the criminal proceedings of Kercher's murder, they discovered that an Italian person from time to time replenished Amanda Knox's narcotic substances, as well as having allegedly had with her the relationship of a sexual nature. And one's got to wonder, who was this person? What was his name? Then from 9 News, it says, the number found on Knox's phone allowed police to bust up a local drug ring involving students and professionals and led to a cocaine dealer's 2-year jail sentence. Then from the Telegraph, Amanda Knox drug dealer associate arrested for attempted knife murder. And that then brings us to the fabric of the Knox case. You've got to say, okay, well, these are just allegations. How does this resonate at all? And does it resonate at all with the fabric of the Knox case as we know it, as it is well known? Do you remember that the boys downstairs in the villa actually operated a marijuana nursery? You know, they actually had pot plants, right? Pot in pots downstairs. I think they were growing them to some extent in the bathroom. And it was Meredith's job to keep the plants watered while they were away. As far as I recall, the basketball court literally just around the corner from the villa where Meredith was murdered was also kind of cafeteria for selling drugs. So what's more likely, that a random intruder murdered Meredith Kercher or someone a lot closer to her, someone who knew her, was close to her, even lived with her? Now, what's intriguing about the Knox case is that the perpetrators seem to want to conflate their crime. So whoever committed this crime seemed to want people to be aware of the well-known criminal culture in Perugia, a culture they were aware of and one they knew the cops were aware of too. What am I talking about? Well, remember, the murder was poorly constructed to look like a burglary. There were some serious problems with that scenario, though. You had glass on top of clothing rather than underneath it. The glass that was broken through the shutter seemed to be broken. How can I put it? The shutters seemed to be closed even though the glass was broken. Also, nothing seemed to be stolen, especially not the most valuable items in the villa. What were the most valuable items? Well, the laptops. All 4 of them were on the desks of the 4 occupants. And that is a relevant thing because even Rudy Gaudet was caught with a stolen laptop. So if the point of the burglary was to steal valuable items and there were 4 laptops, why were none of them stolen? Number 4, intertextualities. Can you think of other cases that involve drugs or alcohol? Well, how about the Murdaugh murders? And if you reckon the drug narrative isn't relevant here, well, Murdaugh himself tried to rely on it as an excuse for why he committed the crimes. Well, it was an excuse the judge rejected. If you do accept that drugs were relevant to the Murdaugh murders, but within a compendium of other compounding factors, including greed, then one has to wonder whether the extreme nature, think about the crime in the Murdaugh murders, double murder, and I'm really talking about the sheer brutality of it, the sheer unnecessary violence of it. Do you think that the drugs encouraged that aspect, unleashed that aspect, right? Do you think the drugs and drug use made the crime kind of the way that it was? I guess what I'm trying to say is, do drug addicts more or less resemble psychopaths? Does the drug addiction lead to more kind of psychopathic crimes? And we can also ask, does more and more extreme drug use tend to be associated with more and more extreme violence and violent crimes? And there's a singer just recently who behaved in a very violent and erratic way. What do you think that was associated with? Can you think of another case involving drug use from a prime suspect and then extreme violence, perhaps involving a knife? Well, how about Brian Coburg and the Idaho 4? Can you think of any other cases that involve drugs and murder? So what do you think? Are drugs relevant in this case? Are they very relevant due to extreme use or abuse, or just relevant? What else is relevant? Do you think drug use might escalate over a holiday weekend and during Halloween? I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time from Perugia.